Arguably no person better epitomizes America in the 1920s than Henry Ford. And no place in the United States better exemplifies Henry Ford and his vision than the town that he built, Dearborn, Michigan. And that's where I am today. Right now I'm outside the Henry Ford Museum at Greenfield Village, the historic representation of a past agricultural America that Ford constructed later in his life as a museum and as a learning space to teach Americans in an industrial society about the way that Americans had lived in the agricultural past. But what I'd like to do from here is to visit some of the other landscapes of Dearborn, and in particular the factory that Ford built here, the River Rouge, which was in the 1920s the center of American industrial capitalism. Here I am at the gates of the Rouge. This plant behind me, which is the headquarters of the Ford Motor Company for most of the 20th century. And when it was built in the late 19-teens and early 1920s, it was the largest industrial facility on planet Earth. By the mid-1920s, over 100,000 people worked here at Ford Motors, and it was the center and the emblem of American industrial capitalism in the 1920s. The Rouge plant encapsulated Henry Ford's vision for an industrial America and a consumer-based economy. Henry Ford had innovated over in the city of Detroit at his Highland Park plant in the 19-teens with the moving assembly line, and it put together the elements of Fordism. But by the late 19-teens, his production was already outgrowing that site, and so Ford began plans here on a 1,000-acre site outside of the city of Detroit in a new town that Ford would dominate right through the present, known as Dearborn, and would build this factory, and it would become literally Ford's vision of a fully integrated industrial facility that took raw materials in and spit out fully finished Ford automobiles. Raw materials for the making of steel came in here, iron from the Mesabi Iron Range, coal and coke from southwest Pennsylvania were brought here on great ships across the Great Lakes and moved by railroads owned by Ford and brought here to a great steel facility where steel was made. And then that steel was rolled out into sheets, and then those sheets were stamped into all of the various parts that went into making a 5,000 part interchangeable automobile that was the miracle of mass production in Ford's heyday. Not only was the steel made here that made the automobiles, but they also brought in soybeans here to make enamel for the paints. They brought in here the glass was made. They brought sand and silica to make glass. There was a leather tannery here to make the leather for the leather seating. And when the Rouge was finished, it was the largest industrial facility anywhere on the planet, the largest probably that the planet ever saw. And it was a model for, and really an emblem of, American industrial capitalism in the 1920s. So that's one critical reason that the Rouge is important for American history and reflects Ford's vision for America and its impact on the economy. But Ford was also important in stamping his own vision of a social America, a social vision, and that social vision was illustrated here as well. There may have been 100,000 workers here on the Rouge by the mid-1920s, and they came from all over the world. Italians from southern Italy, people from the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Russian Empire, Greeks, as well as African Americans from the rural South. People who came here to get a job at Ford and saw that as the basis of their story for upward mobility. But once they got to the factory door and the employment line, they stood in two different lines. So Ford's social vision for this new industrial economy was divided right up the middle by race. And so ethnic workers on their way to becoming white worked in separate sections of the factory. African American workers worked in another section of the factory. And so although Ford would employ more African Americans in this factory than all of the other Detroit automakers combined, about 10,000 by the mid-1920s, he nonetheless had a vision for a sharply segregated industrial future. That was true also in the social world of Dearborn, the town that Ford created around his plant, and the town where he in fact lived. Ford made it possible for tens of thousands of his white industrial workers to buy homes here in Dearborn. He even made it possible by having money taken out of their check every week and put into a home mortgage so that they could buy a home on money that they made right here in the Ford plant. But Dearborn in the 1920s and all the way through the mid-20th century was a segregated town, a sharply segregated place where it was said that the sun should never set on an African-American person because it was dangerous to be here unless you were on a trolley car on the way into work or on the way home from work. And Dearborn elected a mayor several times in the 1950s and the 1960s, a guy called Orville Hubbard, who would maintain a sharply segregationist line in the era of American civil rights. But at the same time, Ford would also provide home mortgages and sort of the same deal for African-American workers in another town not so many miles away, a place called Inkster. So here we have this vision of an America of prosperity, of consumer-driven prosperity, of individual upward mobility, of hard work for working class people from many, many different backgrounds all over the planet, but one that remained divided by this social vision of race that Ford brought with him to his mission and to his work, and which he shared with so many other American industrialists of the era. So there it is, the Ford Rouge, America and industrial capitalism, and the vision of Henry Ford in the 1920s and throughout the mid-20th century.